Welcome to the Progressive Primitivist podcast, where we believe that the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. If you're a preacher in Churches of Christ, you're probably very interested in the history of the Restoration movement. And one of the foremost authorities on that history was a man by the name of David Edwin Harrell Jr. Brother Harrell died back in March of 2021, and he finished out his teaching career at Auburn University. And one of the best books on the history of Churches of Christ is his book, Churches of Christ in the 20th Century, Homer Hailey's Personal Faith Journey. Over the next few weeks, we're going to share 3 lectures that Brother Harrell gave based on this book. We hope that you enjoy.
All right. Well, now, in this hour, we will get to some more complicated material and slightly more controversial material. By the way, although he told me not to tell you, I want to tell you that Rob Hailey's in the audience this morning, Brother Hailey's son. Brother Hailey always loved coming to Abilene and visiting with Rob out on the old Manley Ranch. And so I've appreciated that Abilene connection and Rob's being here this morning. Now I'm going to give you my theoretical spin on what's happened in the Churches of Christ. I have a good friend named Sam Hill, who's one of the leading religious sociologists in the country, and I'm more of a historian than I am a sociologist. But the sociologists, it seems to me, do inform us about this. But the sociologists make all kinds of models and theories and so on. And anyhow, I've been on lots of conferences with Sam, and he would put forth these high-flying theories and models and so on. And my standard compliment for him when he get done is, Sam, I really enjoyed that. That was stimulating. Some of it might have even been true. So that may be the way you view this presentation this morning, that some of it may be true. But at any rate, it seems to me that I can identify these 5 fairly well-defined phases in what has happened to Churches of Christ in the Restoration movement. I'm not going to talk about these early phases in the history of the movement, but if you take the first 60, 70 years of the Restoration movement, I would say what it is it's extraordinary success. That is, it spreads rapidly. They, baptize a couple of 100,000 people, establish congregations across the upper Midwest. It's not a period, however, that's devoid of problems. There's lots of problems and lots of debate and schism. So they spin groups off. There's some eccentric groups like the Christadelphians. Some go to Mormonism. The Civil War, slavery had a very divisive impact on the churches, as did certain doctrinal issues such as the Missionary Society and instrumental music. Now, what I use that to set up is that it seems to me within the Restoration movement there are 2 different kinds of divisions that take place. And by the way, some people have critiqued my book and said that, well, your book is just about division. That's all it's about. Well, that is kind of what we're about. There are other strains there. There are other strains, by the way, that are not in my book. For instance, I will tell you something that is not in my book, and that is black Churches of Christ. And I think nobody has done that very well, partly because that is in some ways a discrete and separate story. That is, they don't follow my evolution that I've got up here at all. They kind of have a life distinct all their own, and some good graduate student has got a good topic to do in dealing with the evolution of black churches. that is, as distinct and separate kind of entities. Now, we are entering a period now of a more integrated Churches of Christ, and I'm not sure what the life of black churches will be in the future, but at any rate, that's a different topic. Well, what I would tell you is that it seems to me that we constantly go through periods in which we have divisions, but they are divisions essentially between what I call like-minded people. That is, there are periods when, more or less, everybody in the movement has the same hermeneutical understandings and has the same basic understandings of what the churches are. And consequently, they have divisions, but they are essentially personality divisions. They're divisions that result from kind of doctrinal eccentricities. Our movement has always had a hard time accommodating extreme forms of premillennialism. Now, obviously, we've had lots of millennial ideas within the movement, but premillennial movements that undermine the doctrine of the church have always just spun off. We've had social and cultural divisions so that you got churches north and churches south. But in most of these periods, phases, when we have a relatively united movement, those are congregational divisions. Congregations divide about lots of different things. There is a second kind of division that takes place within the Restoration movement that I say is based on a division of divided minds, separations of divided minds. That is, it seems to me that there are kind of seemingly deterministic evolutions that take place, that over a period of time, new generations appear, and they spread out on the spectrum. They have broad sociological and intellectual foundations, and people, when that happens, the churches separate from one another. And by the way, I frequently, in giving lectures on history, whether you're talking about churches or the country or whatever, if you talk about the history of the churches of Christ and get down 100 years later and the people are dividing and the question arises, well, what happened to all those people? They had all set out and they were doing well, and what happened to those people? And the answer is, those people died. And you get another generation of people. So that you'll have one generation that is mostly poor Tennessee, Texas, farmers, and farmer preachers, and most of them bivocational preachers. And then you get their grandchildren who have been to Harvard and the University of Chicago and have made money and become doctors and want to be in the good graces of their Episcopalian bankers. And they are and they're different people with different intellectual assumptions, different presumptions about what religion ought to be. And when you get different people, then what's going to happen is you're going to have different churches. So people spread out. Now I want to talk about this period beginning in 1900 or so, which is where my book starts. And my book, by the way, does not quite as clearly outline all of these things, which I'm going to outline for you this morning as I've got them here, which will make the book slightly more interesting than my lecture is. But this is the framework that I see growing out of this. And that is, if you take the period from 1900 to 1950, I'll tell you what happens in the Churches of Christ between 1900 and 1950. They grow very rapidly. When the Churches of Christ spin off, which you can't really take a date and say, because they spin off from the Restoration movement in different time periods. I mean, lots of times we cite 1906, the religious census is 1906, which notices that the Churches of Christ are no longer Christian churches or disciples of Christ, and they're about 10%, 10 to 12%. And most of the people in the disciples of Christ thought that they were an irrelevant extreme group. that they would come to nothing because they were opposed to everything. They were called, by the way, antis. Did you know that? The churches of Christ were called by the disciples antis because they were anti-instrumental music and anti-missionary society. And I suspect most people in the audience, but some of you in the audience probably don't know that I myself have lived my life in non-institutional churches of Christ, or antis. So if I had my chart back up there, I used to many years ago. I taught up in East Tennessee, and I had a graduate student from the independent Christian churches up here, which there are a lot of them up there. And he knew that that I'd written a book about the Restoration Movement, but he didn't know where I belonged in all that maze of stuff up there. And so finally he said to me one day, he said, "Dr. Harrell," he said, "I discovered that you are an anti," by which he meant this. And I said, "Son," I said, "you have no idea." I said, "I'm an anti." So anyhow, the movement grows very rapidly. It grows rapidly for several reasons. Number one, because there are people like Homer Hailey. We're out holding 3-week meetings, baptizing 25, 30 people. And if you read the papers, and you'll just read about those scores of baptisms that people would do every year. And I will tell you a second reason, if I were preaching a sermon on this, why they grew. They grew because churches of Christ were filled with people of conviction who believed that they had a message that they needed to share with other people. When you get messageless, you will not grow. That's why cults grow. Cults grow for two reasons. They grow in the first place because they think they've got something that nobody else in the world has. And they grow in the second place because they get people's loyalty not because they give them something, but because they make them give something. And I will tell you what makes devout people, but then I'm going to stop preaching and go back to my history here. And that is, devout people are people who are sacrificial people. And that's what that generation was. Another reason they grew, by the way, is lots of people came out of Christian churches into churches of Christ. There are always these internal migrations within the Restoration Movement. There are always people going in both directions. And there are like highly visible people who go out of churches of Christ into Christian churches. Generally speaking, better educated people and upwardly mobile people. But there are always many more people gravitating out of Christian churches into churches of Christ. Most of them, not converts of any particular argument, not because somebody proved to them that instrumental music was wrong, but just because they left one place and went to another place and they liked it better. And they were more comfortable there. So they grow. But there are all kinds of issues, nonetheless. It's not peaceful. So if you read about that period and you read my book, you'll see what they did is they argued all the time. They argued had serious arguments about pacifism, which is a tradition in our movement which we have tended to lose. And I sort of regret that. The covering and related issues, located preachers' salaries, colleges, and institutional issues. Institutional issues were debated for a long time before they became divisive in the 1950s and 1960s. And I will tell you, I think they became divisive not because of the issues, but because of the setting, although the issues will be debated. But the issues were debated for a long time, moral issues, dress, and so on. So, I mean, and congregations divide about those things. But there's no general sorting out. And, of course, we still have all of those things with us. So that you can divide a congregation in Alabama about a woman's dress real easily. Here's a digress and tell you one more. My favorite India story. Some of you may know I've lived in India for 3 years as a Fulbright professor and also have done a lot of preaching over there. And I had a funny thing happen 2 or 3 years ago when a preacher from very conservative preacher from North Alabama came over to India. And he was talking to one of the Indian preachers about the Indian women's dress. which they dress in saris, which are very beautiful and very modest dresses, as you know. However, they do have bare midriffs. And so this Alabama preacher said to this Indian preacher, he said, brother, he said, why don't these Indian women, when they become Christians, cover their stomachs up? And this guy said, well, he thought about it a minute. He said, well, the reason is because the top of a sari just comes to here and the bottom just comes to here. So this guy said, well, he said, I know that, but he said, what I wonder is why they don't make it so it comes on down and covers their stomach up. So he thought about that for a few minutes, and finally he said, that's not the way you make a sari. So okay, you can divide an Indian church over a sari. Now, there were issues during these years that generated actual divisions. But they are divisions that I call divisions among like-minded people. That is, that you had fairly discrete, separated communions of churches, which still exist, that divided over one container, whether you can have Bible classes, and premillennialism. Now, premillennialism is a division that has almost a character of its own, and I talk about it in the book. As Richard Hughes has talked about it a lot in his book. But what I would say about those divisions is that they were not divisions between people who were not viewing the Bible the same. They were almost the divisions that grow out of that kind of excessive, well, not excessive, but extreme commitment to following pattern authority in the Scriptures exactly, so that these communities separate, and more or less they have their own histories after this, and they've gone through cycles more or less like the cycles that I'm going to describe to you. But it seems to me that in the course of the 20th century, after 1950, you have a series of separatings in churches of Christ that follow the sociological pattern that I suggested to you earlier. That they are divisions between people who simply spread out both sociologically and who spread out theologically in such ways that they come to have different attitudes and different kinds of minds. So that by today, there are essentially three separated communions of churches of Christ. And I've got up here just scattered facts that identify these people. I think what's hard is finding names. In the first division, it was convenient that churches had long used three different names: Disciples of Christ, Christian Church, Churches of Christ. And different people like different names. Actually, I like disciple a lot. But what people did is they consequently could kind of select labels, so that although that's quite imperfectly used, and you can run into a Church of Christ in West Virginia real easily that has instrumental music. So but that was more convenient. Today, we don't have that. And honestly, I don't know what to call people. I sure don't like, I'm not going to put out on front non-institutional Church of Christ. And I don't particularly like calling this people that I've got in the middle here conservative. I've generally called people what they want to call themselves. And I'll talk about some of the characteristics of each one of these groups. What you could say is that by 1962, I would say, the non-institutional division in Churches of Christ was pretty well completed. And those churches have gone through a kind of separate existence since the early 1960s. 1962 is an arbitrary date. Basil Baxter and Norval Young used to do a book on preachers in the Churches of Christ, in which they'd list all of the preachers. And by 1962, I could only find 4 non-institutional preachers who still were listed in that book, one of whom was Hailey, by the way. He lasted longer than almost anybody. But by and large, those folks had come to identify themselves as a separated communion. And I think they were probably about 10%. We don't have very good figures, and we don't have any economic data. But I will just tell you that from an anecdotal point of view, I'm pretty sure that it was the poorest and least well-educated group. I know in the early 1960s, I can only think of one other person identified with non-institutional churches of Christ who had a PhD. And so most of the educated people in most of the bigger churches and wealthier churches went in the other direction. Non-institutional churches of Christ have had, as I suggested, their own history. And it's a history that just quickly was marked by, number one, the first generation spent most of its time fighting with the liberals, with people who had accepted institutional practices. Since the middle of the 1960s, when that became relatively less profitable, they've spent most of their time fighting with each other. But actually, they have entered a phase of considerable growth. And like Randy's statement about the Churches of Christ being dead in the water, that is absolutely not true of non-institutional Churches of Christ. They're growing quite rapidly now. And I think will continue for the same reasons that I suggested before, that there's a migration of people from the left to the right, and because there's still a certain commitment in that community. Now, I have to tell you that, let me see what my next chart says. I think I talk about the nature of these divisions in just a few minutes, so I'll come back to some of those points. And you may have questions. I probably will go ahead and lecture my time this morning, and then if you can come back this afternoon, I'll be glad to react to any questions that you might have, because I'm sure I always say a lot of things wrong in this and leave a lot of questions unanswered. Here are the characteristics of the divisions that take place during these years, both in the first one and the second one. Now, let me tell you what these two groups were while we're here. There are a series of issues that are debated here. I'll list those issues in a few minutes. Partly, this was a division between kind of hardcore debaters over what the pattern said. And there's a group in this group. In 1960, we'd have had these two groups together and just said that was the mainstream, as they generally call themselves. And these were the antis. And there was an element in the mainstream that kind of trained their guns on the antis, which is why the spiritual sword was founded. And there consequently was a debate between these two groups. It was a quite literalistic, logician's debate in typical Restoration style. There were many people in the mainstream, however, who were not captivated by that literalistic debate at all, who were going different places. And what I would suggest to you is there were many people in institutional churches that were not there because of those literalistic debates either. There were many people, of whom I would put myself as one, who, if you've read Richard Hughes's book, Richard talks about this apocalyptic tradition in the movement, which I don't like the word apocalyptic at all. I like, rather, the concept of being of a sojourner group or an alienated group or a separated group, a sense of people who feel a kind of counter-cultural relationship with the world, who felt that the churches of Christ were being co-opted after World War II by an on-the-march, boosterism mentality that wanted to make the Church of Christ into a respectable denomination, and were turned off by that and in that sense represented kind of this old alienated apocalyptic tradition in the churches of Christ that says what we need to be is something separate from the world. Now, we'll talk about those concepts later on. But I think both of those are present in the non-institutional movement. Both of them are present in the mainstream as well. And they will lead people in different directions. Now, this division, by the way, a lot of interesting things about this division. I'll talk about it later. I think it is finished, by the way. You may not think so. There are people who would argue today that this is not true, that, as I said, Bob Hooper has argued, that rather what you have is you have most people actually here in the middle somewhere, and that you got these extremists on both sides who kind of will get spun off. I don't think that's true. I think what you have is a division similar to the one that took place in the 19th century, and that there is a group in the middle that I don't know how many of them there are. I haven't read Doug's. I want to read your survey to see if we can determine some things about sizes. I put that they're separated by 1985. There's no good date to say when this separation takes place. 1985, Image started in 1985. That's a good date in which you can say what happens is the way we divide basically is through institutional loyalties. That is, we don't have a denominational headquarters to say we're divided. We don't have anybody with the authority to say that. We divide when the time comes when institutions can no longer identify with all the churches. So that what happens is there are certain magazines that people take, and there's schools. And by the 1980s, this middle group was building an alternate set of institutions in preacher schools and identifying certain magazines. Now there are a lot of people, by the way, who can't figure out where they belong in this, which is fine. And there are other factors that play roles. Relationships do play important roles. But by and large, institutions finally get identities. And I will tell you who has to make decisions is preachers. The time comes when you can't preach across these lines. The time comes when you will not be on the ACU lectureship program and be on the Spiritual Sword lectureship program also. It has been there. That's right. It's been there a good long time. Before 1985, it's just that by 1985, these lines are quite solidified. So both of those groups are, by the way, I think beginning to kind of have a separate evolution in their own right, so that among these folks, the conservative or traditional group, they're beginning to fight with themselves as well and kind of enter a second stage of evolution. Well, okay, that sets up that division. Now, once again, as I suggested in the first hour, I'm not suggesting to you this is the way it ought to be, or that I like it this way, or that I did it. I'm suggesting that this is the way that it is. This is where we are. Now, it's not this neat by any means. There are all kinds of mixed loyalties. It happens at different times in different places. There are many other factors that determine where a congregation belongs and where a person belongs. And those, we need some good social history studies on that. I've got a student in Auburn, now a PhD student, who we're trying to figure out a way that he could actually do a detailed study of some cities like Nashville, Houston, Dallas, and see exactly why congregations end up where they end up. And what you discover is these sociological parameters would tell us something, but there are all kinds of ties of kinship and friendship and powerful preachers and other things that influence where people end up. But what all of us do, all of us, figure out we're going to live somewhere. So what everybody has to do is make a choice. I mean, you may say, well, I don't agree with everybody. I don't agree with everything these people believe about this. Well, I don't either. And my chart, by the way, is not, by the way, about who's going to go to heaven. If you'll notice, I didn't have any arrows pointed toward heaven. It's rather, yeah, we'd have a big arrow pointed in the other direction, probably. It is about everybody making choices what they're going to do. Well, okay. I then go through the institution. I'll go through these divisions with you real quickly this afternoon. But what I want to suggest to you is that in all of these divisions, what I could do is we can establish certain doctrinal parameters and say we argued about these things. Actually, I don't believe divisions of this sort, these kind of spreadings out in the Restoration movement, are much about issues. There are always issues there, and everybody does have to study issues and make up your mind about issues, and I'd be glad to do that. But I would have to tell you that I don't think I've made up my mind on the basis of issues particularly. I don't think Homer Hailey made his mind up on the basis of issues. And that's not really how I make my choice. I don't think that's how most people make their choices. Now, I mean, I can debate. One another, and to believe that they were no longer trying to do the same things. Now, I'm going to put this up for your consideration, and here's where we will begin this afternoon. And that is, here it seems to me is where people were by 1960. Number one, there was this kind of legalistic battle going on in debates and so on about whether you could find biblical pattern for sponsoring churches. That was significant. I suppose, Roy Cogdell and Tom Warren and others debated that, Cecil Wright, and their arguments probably influenced lots of people. And we have this long tradition of debating, of which Boy Wallace Jr. was the great hero of that tradition. But what was also going on at the same time was that this middle group of Churches of Christ, the mainstream, was being critiqued from both the left and the right. And it's being critiqued from the right by people who said what the Churches of Christ are just becoming a denomination. I wrote a tract, by the way, I think I'll refer to it later on. I wrote a tract in 1962 called The Emergence of the Church of Christ Denomination, in which I used all these sociological patterns and argued that what was happening was people were having a denomination, getting a denominational mentality, and that what people wanted is they wanted the Church of Christ to be recognized for what they were, a politically important religious group, among other religious groups. And so that on the march mentality fed partly the revolt on the right. Now, I think it also fed a growing revolt on the left that will lead to the conservative progressive division. And that is by people who came to say, really, Leroy Garrett and Carl Ketchesad early, but really a much more substantial group later on, who came to say that the Churches of Christ are becoming just a conservative, Republican, right-wing denomination captured by its culture. And so, in a sense, the left comes up with the same critique that I argued in the 1960s from the right. By the way, there's a certain kinship in the left and the right. You know that? Which is why I can get along pretty well with people like Richard and Doug, because there are a number of similarities. I think on the left and the right there's a good deal more freedom of expression. Now, that is, I feel perfectly free to say anything I want to say. I get in a lot of trouble for it, but I nonetheless feel perfectly free to do it, as people, it seems to me, on the extreme left do. So that freedom of opinion and a kind of a non-sectarian creedal view of who we are exist on both left and right extremes. And the critique of the mainstream denominational kind of Churches of Christ attitude is more or less the same from both the left and the right. Solution's not the same. We'll talk about that in a moment, because while we both may have a common view of what the problem with the church is, we would both be proceeding on quite different hermeneutical formulas for resolving that problem. But at any rate, you get then this critiquing of Churches of Christ from both the left and the right. Well, I think it's about time. I might have time for one question.
We actually have a few more minutes. We
Okay.
Go maybe 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Why don't we have some time for about 10 minutes for questions and answers right now?
Good.
We can do some more of that this afternoon as well.
Well, I can't believe everybody believes all of that. So, oh, where to put me?
Which way?
Well.
I know Harrell Jr. and all that stuff.
Do you? Well, I'm probably in the same vicinity as Harry Pickup Jr., or he is with me. Yes. Yes. Oh, okay. Oh, that's where I talk about my tract, as saying that these are the sociological characteristics of the division. Honestly, in telling you where I come from, you know, to this audience, I think it's only fair to tell you where I come from, in case you don't know. If I were giving this lecture to a historical society, which I do, I wouldn't tell you where I came from at all, because in the first place they wouldn't know. I mean, you know, like this book, the interesting thing about this book to me is what my professional colleagues will have to say about it. And most of them so far have been quite kind, although I'm sure that they had to learn much, much more about the Churches of Christ than they'd ever want to know. Nor could they possibly understand all of it. Even the language. You realize how our language is so specialized? I used to say years ago, I finally did learn an Indian language called Telugu, but I used to be, for many years, learn no languages. And my European history colleagues would always put American historians down, but you guys don't even have to learn any language. But finally, I came to the conclusion, I told them, I said, look, I speak several languages. I speak Pentecostal, I speak Church of Christ, I speak Fundamentalist, and these are all highly specialized languaes. Yes?
Several of the speakers have alluded to the first night speaker dead in the water. And I believe you said that you did not believe the church was dead in the water. Could you just give us a sentence or two of why you believe that?
Yes. And this is obviously slightly prejudicial, and does reflect where I'm coming from. In the Disciples of Christ, Churches of Christ division, the disciples took 90% of the people. The Church of Christ took 10%. The disciples said the Churches of Christ will die. It is more than slightly ironic, of course, that the disciples of Christ are dying, and have probably, in the last 3 or 4 decades, lost about 40-50% of their members, as have all ultra-liberal Protestant denominations, because what you get is you get intellectual elites who are divorced from connection to the people. And consequently, the people leave. And Churches of Christ, of course, grew quite remarkably. So the Churches of Christ became the biggest one of these wings, I think. I'm pretty sure they are. And, by the way, if you put all of us back together, this probably is the largest American religious movement. It'd be either American Restoration Movement or Mormons. So if you put them all together. So anyhow, what happens is it's this, the Churches of Christ wing that grows. Now, I am of the opinion that the same thing will happen again. And that is, non-institutional Churches of Christ are probably still quite a bit less populous than any other wing of the movement, but they are growing very rapidly. Whereas it seems to me there is a certain stagnation in other wings of the movement. So it's a question of which wing of the movement you're talking about, is whether you're dead in the water or not. And, I would think that there are reasons for that. But, so that's my observation about that. I think it's a particular wing of the movement that's growing right now, which some of us, by the way, I go to speak in non-institutional Churches of Christ now that are absolutely full of people who've come out of institutional Churches of Christ, a third to half the members, which that worries me too. Except that because they don't know anything about it. Most this generation of people doesn't know anything about those divisions on either side. So that makes the environment quite non-prejudicial. And since everybody's called Church of Christ, people just go to the one that's closest to them, and if they like it, they stay there. So I think that's what's happening in that
wing. These traditional people not talking. Why is there not the cross dissemination? Are they insecure? Are they uncomfortable? Are they
3:30, the answer to that question. Yeah, I'll talk about that mindset at 3:30 this afternoon.
That's just they're not talking because that's part of their mindset.
I think that people in the middle tend to have the most denominational or sectarian understanding of who they are. That is, I think what emerges in the middle is what I would call an institutional sect of people who are essentially loyal to what we are or what we were in 1950. And that becomes kind of the model for all time. And that what there is a quite sectarian mentality, whereas as you get out in both directions, there is a more free-flowing commitment kind of to the concept of being countercultural, independent Christians. But I'll develop that theme a little bit more this afternoon.
Also, in response to the question about being dead in the water, there are some statistics in this book. This is the Ministers at the Millennium book that he referred to briefly. a survey of ministers in churches of Christ. And the fact of the matter is that there are quite a number of churches of Christ, of the, I suppose what you'd have to call the progressive wing that, as Dr. Harrell has outlined, that are growing.
Yeah.
They're growing in rapid ways, in vital ways, and this is one of the books that we mentioned earlier in the this series, but didn't mention it this morning. Ministers at the Millennium actually has a lot of the ministers survey did quite a number of questions on congregations and the size of the congregation 5 years ago and today, and looking at the attitudes and the beliefs of these ministers in the congregations that are growing, and looking at the ministers who hold certain positions that might be characterized as progressive, and the size of their congregations as opposed to those ministers who hold more conservative positions and the size of their congregations. You know, you can't say a whole lot about what people believe individually, but it indicates something as far as a relationship. If people don't believe what the preacher's preaching, they're not going to stay there for very long. So I think this book might be of interest to you if you have more questions about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that book is going to be interesting to me too. And I must say, I think Randy's remark maybe was a little hysterical.
Does that survey take into the people that have taken the name Church of Christ off the building?
We did a survey, a random sampling of the people in Matt Lynn's list of Churches of Christ and the list that Dennis Kelly in Searcy, Arkansas had done. So we used those lists, and I also sort of supplemented it with a list of people who were registered here for the lectureship and the congregations. So we did a national sample, a random sample. If a congregation was listed in any of those books and happened to be one that got chosen in the random sample, but they don't have Church of Christ on their building, then perhaps so. But that would have been an absolute minimum if there were any.
Well, that's an interesting question too, and and I'm going to talk about some of these things this afternoon. That name thing is interesting in that it's happening at both ends. That is, there are people in non-institutional circles who no longer like to call themselves Church of Christ because they feel so different from what they would regard as the denominational Church of Christ, as there are people on the extreme left who no longer like to be identified with that group. So those are kind of both extremes. Now, I would guess, and we'll talk about this afternoon, that when you get this progressive traditional split finalized, in the 19th century, up into the 1950s, the liberal group, the Disciples of Christ, had by far a majority. But beginning in the 1950s, they began a drain into independent Christian churches and into Churches of Christ. Now, I would say in this split, all of the colleges in the 19th century went with the Disciples of Christ. Every college, I think. All of the colleges and universities, I think, will be with the progressives in this split. But the initial, you're still in the quite early stages of that, and there'll be lots of drift back and forth. So where people are going to end up is another question. That's like Doug said, but ministers and leaders can take churches in one direction, but if you get them far enough away from where the people are, then the people will leave. So there'll be lots of migration, that goes on.
Let's take one more question.
Oh, okay.
Right.
And talking about all the colleges you believe will go with more progressive element, what about Florida College?
Well, Florida College won't, because Florida College is already had it separated from that, and it's in a different environment. Now, there are people, Florida College, of course, the only college in the non-institutional movement, supported, of course, by individuals, not by churches, which is the technical question. Florida College lives hard. It's hard to be an institution in a non-institutional movement. So you're going to live pretty hard. But it is. But by the way, it is quite lively. In fact, I've been interested to come to your lectureship because Florida College is much smaller than ACU. But I would tell you, its lectureship is not much smaller. I spoke to like 2,100 people last time I spoke at the Florida lectures, and it's a quite vital place. But there are many people in non-institutional movement who would view Florida College as a kind of an opening wedge to a new movement, as all institutions are. They would view Florida College and me as opening wedges, although mine is basically because I've never been very creedally non-institutional. I've always just been extremely anti-cultural captivity. I've been very much, I've always lived with a strong sense of alienation from the society and alienation from culture and the desire to not be captured by that culture. But at any rate, Florida College has, as I say, you're really almost, you're talking about a different church at this point. My children would feel just about as uncomfortable going to a progressive Church of Christ as they would going to a Presbyterian church. They would feel that separated from, as, most of us would feel about a disciples congregation. So generationally at this point, you're talking about people who feel quite separated in these distinct communions. And as I say, I'm not recommending that. I'm telling you that's what exists.
Thank you. We will reconvene at 3:30 this afternoon when Dr. Harrell will bring his third lecture. Let's close with prayer, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Father, we thank you for the beauty of this day, the physical beauty, the sunshine, the temperature. We thank you even more for the beauty of the fellowship, the relationships that we have with one another, for the rich heritage that we share, for the material that Dr. Harrell has brought to us today. We thank you for him and for his study and his thought and his conviction. We pray you'll bless us and watch over us for the rest of this day and bring us back this afternoon to this session and for all the other things that are going on this week. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. I really I should kind of let you know, doesn't it? I don't know where. He's got it on. He's got it.
We're glad to see you too. Yes, sir. Yes. It is. All these books are available either in the bookstore or in the exhibits. The 2 or 3 booksellers rather, in the exhibits. Oh, is that right? Here? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Oh, yes. I think you would love that book. They should have copies of it. I think you would really love that book. No.
You're the third. You're the older boy, man. The second is
Whatever one creates a separate organization which solicits funds from is illegitimate. The same thing in the missionaries.
Let's try to figure out who
Well, it's been a lot of people did not.
Yeah. Now, you're researching now. You live in the place? Oh, we live in the house.
Thank you for joining us today. If you like our content, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you leave a thumbs up on our video and you comment what you thought in the comment section. But also, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you can see our content and whenever we post content. And make sure you follow us on our social medias in the description below. Thank you again. See you next time.